everybody. We are so glad that you are with us as we kick off a brand new series today called Greater. I need everyone over here, not over here, okay? I see where you're already jumping ahead of me. Don't do that, okay? Today we are kicking off this new series, and as I was preparing for this series, one of the things that I realized is that people are typically pretty content with the status quo until someone comes along and offers us something greater. When that happens, something inside of us changes. I don't know what it is about you. I don't know what it is about me. But when we discover that there is something greater, it's almost like we have to have it. Probably the one place where you see this in the most obvious way is in the realm of product development. So for all of you who are 30 years old or younger, you need to know the phone did not always look like this, okay? I'm only 43, but when I was growing up, we actually had one of these bad boys in the house. Anybody remember the rotary phone? Who had one of these growing up? Okay, we got to do a better job of reaching the next generation. We're all getting old, right? We had one of these growing up. In fact, this was the only phone in the house. And this was in my kitchen. So how many of you remember not just the rotary phone? Anybody have the party line? Let me see your hand. Wow, yeah, the party line. Man, all the teenagers are like, what? Like, no, it's not a party line like you would think a party line. This is a totally different thing, right? I hated this phone for a lot of reasons. For one, you can imagine this thing did not have any contact information saved in it, right? So you actually had to know people's phone numbers, right? And then you had to go through all of this really long work to dial up their number. People got carpal tunnel from using this thing. It was terrible, right? But along came someone who discovered a greater way. They created this magic device, and instead of having to just kind of use the big wheel to call people up, you could just punch in the number really quickly and you could have people on the phone in a matter of seconds. Now, the problem with this phone right here was the cord, right? I don't know if you remember this, but if you were like me, man, you only had one phone in the house and you just felt tied to the wall in a very real way. And so you're over there trying to talk to your girlfriend and your mom's in the same room, and it's just like, man, this is not working. And so finally someone came along with something even greater, the 25-foot cord. This thing was unbelievable, man. Like you could stretch it into another room, you would slide it under the door, you would shut the door, and then you could have all these magical conversations with your girlfriend, right? Guys, don't forget tomorrow's Valentine's Day, by the way. Then someone came along with something greater. It was the cordless phone, and you could just walk anywhere in the house with this bad boy. This thing was absolutely incredible. And just when you thought it couldn't get any better, someone came up with something even greater. Now, for all of you who think this is a Bible in a cover, it's not, okay? This right here was what we called the bag phone, okay? I got to ask, who had a bag phone? Now, keep your hands up, okay? Keep them up just for a second. Everybody with their hands up, they were rich back in the day, okay? And here's how I know that, okay? This thing didn't just cost a fortune to buy. It cost a fortune to use, okay? Like you use your cell phone now, doesn't cost you anything to make a phone call. This was $1 a minute back in the day, okay? So the conversation usually sounded something like this. Mom, I made it safe and sound, I promise. Yep, I love you too, bye. And you would hang up as quickly as possible because that thing right there, I mean, it was a fortune for people to use. And so finally, someone came along with something even greater, the flip phone. Now, I'm going to tell you something that you forgot about the flip phone, okay? The reason this thing was greater is not just because it kept you from carrying a purse with you everywhere you went, but you could pop this bad boy in your pocket, and it was free after 7 and on weekends. Do you remember that, right? And so you could get on this thing and you could make, kids that don't even understand this, you could make what was called a long distance phone call with one of these things, and it didn't cost you anything if you were calling during the right time of the day. And then, of course, finally, this guy named Steve Jobs came along. You've probably heard of him, and he created the iPhone, and the world has never been the same since. My point is simply this. When we discover something greater, we have to have it. And I want you to understand that that's not just true in terms of products that we buy. It's true really in every arena of life. And so this week, and really for the next 4 or 5 weeks, I'm going to ask you to spend some time with me exploring something that is indeed greater. And his name is Jesus. As John continues to write the story of Jesus, he takes some time to help his readers understand what is it specifically that really does make Jesus greater. Now, this is so important for you to understand as you just kind of consider your need for Jesus and what it looks like to be a follower of him. In order for you to buy into a new and a better product, what do? What they do is they highlight all of the features in the new product that you don't have in the product that you currently have. So when the new iPhone comes out, they'll say, man, this has a better camera. It's got all these other features. You're going to want this product because it offers you some greater things that what you're currently living with, you don't have in your life. They're highlighting all of the features to get you to buy into the product, to convince you that you have to have the product. And let me tell you something. The same is true in your relationship with Jesus. Growing up, a lot of us were told that we needed to follow Jesus, but we didn't really fully understand why. We were told that we needed to believe. We were told that we needed to have faith. But no one really explained to us why that was such an important part of our lives. And so what we did is we chose to believe, we chose to have faith because we were kids. And I'll just tell you, if that's your story and you've never done what the New Testament encourages us to do, which is to work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, if you've never really thought through your faith or why you believe, and you don't really understand what makes Jesus greater, then my concern for you is that you're headed to a crisis of faith. In fact, here's what I know to be true about so many people. The faith that we adopt as a child is hard for us to hold on to as an adult. At some point, you step into the real world. At some point, you run into real questions. At some point, you encounter some real problems in your life, and all of a sudden, your faith just doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense anymore. It was fine for Sunday morning. It was great for Sunday school. But when you became an adult and you walked out of church on Sunday afternoon and you were trying to figure out how faith impacted your life between that moment and Saturday night, if your faith didn't impact your life, it became very, very easy for you to walk away. In fact, Frank Turek says it like this. He says the reason that most people are so easily talked out of Christianity is because they were never talked into it in the first place. You don't just want to have faith. You don't just want to believe. You need to understand why. And this right here is the primary reason that John wrote this book in the New Testament, the Gospel according to John. John wrote this down not to tell you what to believe. He didn't write it all down to tell you that you need to believe. He was writing so that we would have a reason to believe. In fact, I want you to listen to how John said it in his own words over in John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. You need to know that most scholars believe that this is the central thesis statement for the entire Gospel of John. He's putting it at the end of the book as a summary statement rather than the beginning of the book as an intro statement, but here it is. This is what he wrote. He said, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these, the signs that he's writing about, are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing, you may have life in his name. So you know what John's saying? John's saying Jesus did a lot of things. I didn't write everything down, but I wrote a lot of these things down, and he called these, this is so important, he called these things signs. not just miracles. In fact, if you study the Gospel of John carefully, you'll see that there are 7 different signs that pop up throughout the Gospel of John. That's important. Why? Because signs by design, they do at least 2 things for us. Signs communicate important information, and signs always point you in the right direction. And that is why John wrote this gospel. He knew that without signs, you would be both completely lost, and he knew that you would be completely confused. And so he writes down all of these miraculous things that Jesus did that really do serve us as signs, because those things, they communicate really important information and they point us in the right direction. They help us see that the way of Jesus, that he's doing greater things and he's pointing us in a greater path for our lives. John doesn't just want you to believe. John wants you to have a reason to believe, because he knows that if you don't understand it, then it's really easy for someone to talk you out of it. And so I would say today that the goal of this series is to really help us start to comprehend and wrap our minds around why Jesus really and truly is greater. And so let's jump in. John chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, I want to walk you down through verse 5 to get us started. The text says this: on the 3rd day, it's really important. A lot of important things happened on the 3rd day. I want you to keep that in mind. On the 3rd day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." Now, stop right there. Time out before we read the next verse. I need to say to all of the young people in the room, especially young men in the room, typically speaking, I encourage you to emulate everything that Jesus says and everything that Jesus does, okay? But this is going to be one exception right here, this next line. And here's why. The translation from Greek to English a little bit gets lost. Really, Jesus is being very, very respectful to his mother. But in our culture, we would not see this as a very, very respectful statement. So Jesus goes on and he says, "Woman, don't go there with your mother. Why do you involve me?" Okay? And so teenagers, next time mom is trying to get you to help her load the dishwasher, do not say to her, "Woman, why do you involve me?" Right? Do not go there with your mother, right? Be respectful, obey your mother. Jesus replied, "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now, in the first chapter of John, where we've been for the last 5 weeks or so, we really do not see a lot from Jesus. We just hear a lot of things about Jesus. But in chapter 2, all of that changes. From this point forward, you're going to see a lot from Jesus, because Jesus is getting ready to use this moment. He's getting ready to use this wedding as his coming out party. Jesus is getting ready to show the world who he really is. He's getting ready to start or to launch his ministry. And in doing so, he is starting a revolution that has been going strong now for 2,000 years. Now, as we look at these types of stories in the Gospel of John, what you're going to discover is that Jesus is almost always operating on 2 totally different levels. He's usually doing something on the physical level, and then he's also doing something to work in people's lives on a spiritual level. And I need you to know why. The reason that Jesus operates on the physical and the spiritual is because he knows that both of those have a profound impact on your life and your well-being. Jesus is not just concerned about what's going on in your spiritual life. He is very much concerned about what is going on in your whole life. And so Jesus is going to be operating on the surface level, and almost everyone sees that. But then Jesus is also going to do something on a deeper spiritual level, and only a few people see that. Jesus is going to work to address people's spiritual needs, but he's also working to meet their physical needs. And I would say this is one of the things that makes Jesus so much greater. right? You look at the world that we live in. The world may care about some of the things that are going on in your life in terms of the physical well-being. They don't give a rip about your spiritual well-being. Religion may care about you spiritually, but they don't really do a lot for you in other aspects of your life. I want you to see that Jesus cares about both. Jesus cares about what's going on in the physical realm of your life, but Jesus also cares about what's going on the deeper spiritual level of your life. And so if you go back to the story, what you see is Jesus is operating on both levels. Jesus is going to start in the most obvious sense to do something on the physical level. The people at the wedding are having a great time. In fact, they've probably had a little too good of a time because they're 3 days into what was traditionally a 7-day celebration, and they are already out of wine. Now, if you've ever been to a wedding, then you know everyone involved in the wedding, they want the wedding to be perfect, right? Her hair needs to be perfect. Her dress needs to be perfect. The venue needs to be perfect. The weather's supposed to be perfect. The band is supposed to be perfect. The preacher better be perfect, right? Everything needs to be perfect, including the food and the drinks. But this wedding was not perfect because they were 3 days into a 7-day celebration and they have already run out of wine. Now, you need to know in this culture and in this context, this would have been a very embarrassing situation for this family. In fact, the people who were going to drop by later in the week to congratulate the new bride and the new groom on their new relationship and their love for one another, they would have not only been disappointed in this culture, they probably would have felt very dishonored. And so there would have been a lot of tension at this point in the wedding celebration. There would have been a lot of finger pointing going on. In fact, she was probably looking at her new husband going, "Why didn't your family buy more wine?" And he's probably looking at his wife going, "Why is your family drinking so much wine? Your relatives are drunk in the corner. Like the problem is not with us. The problem is with you guys." And I'm telling you, this marriage would have probably already been off to a rocky start. And Jesus' mom, this lady Mary, she sees the problem and she goes straight to the one who can do something about the problem. In fact, in verse 3, she says to Jesus, "They have no more wine." Now, I need you to see this. Mary is not saying this to Jesus to inform him. She's saying it to involve him. If you don't know that, I really need you to learn that today. That when we have an opportunity in the midst of a crisis to go to Jesus, we don't go to him and inform him about our crisis. The goal is to involve him in our crisis. So when life is falling apart for you, when your boyfriend or your girlfriend breaks up with you, when your spouse is cheating on you, when your career is in the toilet, when you're in a financial crisis of some kind, when a doctor comes along and just drops a bomb on you, you go to Jesus in the middle of that crisis because you need to know that you can always depend on Jesus in the midst of a crisis. This is why Mary goes to Jesus. She knows whenever there's a crisis, I can always depend on Jesus. And so she's going to Jesus, and she's not just trying to inform him about what's going on in the situation. She's going to him because she wants to involve him in the situation. And so this is the surface level. And so as you think about the surface level, the crises that you deal with in your own life on a physical level, I want to ask, is there some kind of crisis in your life because there is some kind of shortage in your life? So in this situation, there's a wedding crisis because there's a shortage of wine. That's not your crisis. In fact, your crisis is probably far more important than this crisis. And so let me ask you, are you in a marriage crisis because there's a shortage of patience? Like you're growing really impatient, maybe even out of patience with a spouse who is reluctant, unwilling, or incapable of change? Are you in a midlife crisis? Because you feel like you're running out of time. And so you look at your life and you see very clearly, my best years are already behind me. They're in the rearview mirror. Don't feel like you got a lot to look forward to. You're running out of time. And so you find yourself in a midlife crisis. Some of you may find yourself in a financial crisis where you feel like you're running out of money. Some of you are in a professional crisis. You are so worn down from the last 2 years. You're running out of energy. You're running out of drive. You're running out of answers. You're running out of creativity. You're running out of solutions. As soon as Mary realizes that there is a crisis, she goes straight to Jesus because she knew whenever there's a crisis, I can always depend on him. See, we can sit here all day long and we can say, like we did in the last series, it's not about religion. It really is about relationship. It's not about the rules and trying to get right with God by following the rules. It's really more about following Jesus. We did that last series. And there were a lot of people who were like, yes, man, it's not about religion. It's about relationship. So my question for you is, when you're in a crisis, do you leverage the relationship? Do you really go to him in that moment when you need him the most and say, I need you. I'm not just trying to inform you. I really am trying to involve you in what's going on in my situation and in my life. If you're anything like me, the answer is you probably don't do that. I mean, I'm embarrassed to admit, when there's a crisis in my life, I worry myself sick. When there's a crisis in my life, I stress myself out and then I stress everyone around me out. When I'm in the middle of a crisis, I become a control freak. I become the kind of person who wants to fix it all by myself and control everything and everyone around me. And what I've learned over the course of my life is that there's not just another option. I've learned that there is a far greater option. That you and I, we really can leverage the relationship and we can involve Jesus because he doesn't just care about our spiritual life. He actually cares about your whole life. Now, Jesus is there and he is at this party with all of his buddies, okay? And his mom, in a very real way, has just called him out, okay? I imagine that if Jesus was a little bit younger, he might have looked at her and be like, Mom, you're embarrassing me in front of all my friends, right? But Jesus is like 30 at this point in his life, and so he doesn't really go there. But what Jesus does say is he says, woman, why do you involve me in this? It's like Jesus' way of saying, I didn't come into the world to save a wedding. I came to save the whole world, right? And so Jesus hears her asking, and Jesus is going to respond. Now notice that he responds by saying, woman, why do you involve me in this? And she doesn't even answer him. She just looks at him. And I imagine that she looked at him with that same look that your mama used when she looked at you. You know, the look that's like, I don't care how big you are, I will bend you over my knee in front of God and everybody. The problem is, Jesus was God, and he made everybody, so it's a little awkward, right? Now, Jesus, being the respectful man that he is, a man who wants to honor his mom and even obeys his mom, he just looks at this situation and he goes, okay, this is the moment. This is the moment when I'm going to go public with my ministry, when I'm going to launch this thing. And so in a very real way, Jesus is saying, let's get this party started, okay? Chapter 2, verses 6 through 10. Watch what he says. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water, they knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside And he said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best for now. Now, when I look at this passage, I'm telling you, everything that Jesus brings to the table, it truly is greater. Jesus doesn't just give them far more than they need. What Jesus does is he gives them something that is better than anything they've ever had. In fact, the master of the banquet, he was the kind of guy who probably did this on a very regular basis, and he is absolutely blown away by what just happened. He's looking at this situation and tasting this wine, and he's going, man, where in the world have you been hiding this stuff? And why in the world have we been drinking $2 Chuck all week, right? That this stuff is top shelf. Why? Because everything that Jesus provides, it is greater. And so I just want to say, on a surface level, in a crisis, you don't need to worry yourself sick. You don't need to stress yourself out. You don't have to control everything and everybody, but you do have to involve Jesus. And you have to be willing to work on his timetable, not your timetable. See, in this story, there is a crisis. And these people aren't on the brink of running out. They are already out. In fact, some of you may be in a financial crisis right now. And you're on the brink of running out. And you're watching the money dwindle away. And you don't know how you're going to get out of this. You don't know what's going to happen. What if Jesus says, I want to bring you to a point of absolute desperation. I don't just want you to be close to running out. I want you to run out, completely out, so that you have no other options. You have no other hope, so that when I show up and I give you far more than you could have abundantly asked for or imagined, it doesn't just get you excited about the result. It gets you excited about your relationship with him, because your faith in him is starting to grow in ways that it could have never grown apart from the crisis. I tell people all the time, the worst thing that ever happens in your life is usually the greatest thing that could ever happen to your faith. This is the way in which Jesus works in the midst of a crisis. In fact, I've seen it with my own eyes. 5.5 years ago, this church was not in a great place. The money was dwindling, so much so that some of the elders like to joke about the fact that we were getting ready to do a touch and go. And by touch and go, they meant we were going to go all the way down to zero and then hope and pray to God that we took back off again. And let me tell you something. In the course of those months where we were in a crisis that I hope we never go through again, everybody was blown away at the way in which God showed up in this church and the way that he's been faithful to us over the last 5 years. It absolutely caused our faith to grow because we were in the midst of a crisis. And in the midst of a crisis, God can do some things in your life that he could not do if everything were just fine and dandy. It's not just true financially. It's true in your marriage. It's true if you're going through a midlife crisis. It's true if you're in the middle of a career crisis. He can step in those crises, and he can do some things in your life that cause your faith to grow in him. I promise you this, I don't know what you're up against, but whatever you're dealing with in your life right now, I promise you this, if he can turn water into wine, he can fix whatever problem you've got going on in your life. Now, all of that is just the stuff that's happening on the surface level. And let me tell you, everyone at the party was able to see that. But Jesus is doing something on an even deeper level, and only a few people see that. Everyone tasted the wine, but a lot of people who were at that party, they completely missed the sign. A lot of people were there. A lot of people were able to see the miracle, but they didn't even see what was really happening on a deeper level, right? Now remember, this is not just a miracle, this is actually a sign. And what does a sign do? It communicates important information. And it always points us in the right direction. And yet almost everyone at this party missed it because they're not looking for it. Most people in the world aren't looking at the deeper level. They're thinking about what's happening in the physical realm. And they're not thinking about what should be or could be happening on the spiritual realm. And so the master of the banquet, he does not understand what Jesus has just done. He assumed that he overlooked a private stash somewhere and must have missed it. He assumes that maybe the groom's buddies made a beer run and they came back with some much better stuff than they had had earlier in the week. He doesn't understand what is really happening here. The guests of the party are completely oblivious. The bride and the groom, they have no clue. All of the people at this wedding, they enjoyed the blessing, but they completely missed the point. And it happens all the time in our world because we're obsessed with the physical and we're not really giving a whole lot of thought to the spiritual. We're so caught up in the here and the now, we're not thinking about the then and the there. Do not miss it. In fact, if you go back and you read the story carefully, specifically down in verse 6, you're probably going to see it. Verse 6 says that there were these 6 stone water jars that were used for ceremonial washing. These jars were not used for drinking purposes. They were used for washing purposes. They were used for people to cleanse themselves, right? Jesus did not choose these jars by accident. He chose them on purpose because he was trying to help them see that he had a far greater plan. These people at this wedding, the reason that they had all of these jars that were used for washing is because they had this awareness. They knew that there were things in their life. They knew that there were things that they had said, that there were things that they had done. There were places that they had been that made them unclean, unfit, and unworthy to be in the presence of God. They knew the problem, and so they came up with the best solution that they could. They had these jars that were full of water, and they used the water for these rituals and for these traditions and these ceremonies to somehow try to clean themselves up a little bit so that they could get right with God or go into the presence of God. If you grew up in church, maybe the Catholic Church, then you might be familiar with this thing called holy water, kind of like that. If you didn't grow up in church at all, it's kind of like this. It's like that moment when you said some things that you probably shouldn't have said, and your mom said, "Come on, we're going to the bathroom. I'm going to wash your mouth out with soap." Right? That's what this was like. It was people who knew, I've said some things I shouldn't have said. I've done some things in my life that I shouldn't have done, and I need some way for me to clean myself up a little bit, to clean up my act so that I can get myself right with God. People didn't just do it back then. People have been living that way since the history of mankind began. We all have some kind of plan to clean ourselves up and make ourselves right with God. Here's how it works for most people. I know I need to clean up my language. I need to clean up my behavior. Then I need to fix my marriage. I need to break this addiction. I need to get back into church. I need to start serving. I need to join a group. I need to start being more generous with my money. And if I can do all of these things, then I can get myself right with God. This is the way in which a lot of people think. And yet, I want to point out to you, it's an exhausting way for you to try to live your life. It is a never-ending, constant beatdown as you try to clean yourself up so that you are good enough to get yourself in relationship with God. And Jesus knew that this was an exhausting way for people to live. In fact, listen to what he said in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 to 30. Jesus said to the people, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Jesus has offered people an alternative to get right with God that is far, far, far greater than the heavy burdens and the demands of religion. He looks at those jars. He says, I want you to fill them up with water. And then Jesus does something where he turns that water into wine. It's not just a miracle. It's a sign that was intended to communicate important information and to point us in the right direction. Now, I want to remind you that wine in the New Testament, it was almost always used as a symbol of Jesus' blood, right? You see it in John 6, see it in a lot of passages, but you also see it at the Last Supper. Jesus knows the very next day he's going to be arrested, he's going to be crucified, he's going to die. And as he eats this final meal with his disciples, he says to them, he says, I want you to take this cup that was full of wine, and he says, I want you to drink it in remembrance of me, because this is my blood that is being poured out for you. And so when Jesus turns this water into wine, remember, it's not just a miracle, it's a sign. Signs communicate important information. It's Jesus' way of communicating. You people don't need this water anymore. You people don't need these traditions anymore. You people don't need all of these ceremonies. You don't have to keep jumping through all of these hoops. What you need is something greater. What you need is Jesus. His sacrifice, his blood that was all shed on our behalf. It really is far greater. And this right here is how Jesus chose to go public with his ministry. From the very start of his ministry, what is he doing? He's pointing people to the very end of his ministry. From the very first day of his public ministry, he is pointing people to the very last day of his ministry, the day that he would lay down his life for his people. See, letting Jesus do it for you is far, far greater than you trying to do it for yourself and failing over and over and over again. And so he does this sign. And then John says this in verse 11. He says, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. They didn't believe because someone told them, you need to believe. They believed because Jesus gave them a reason to believe. And so I know a lot of you have been coming around since the beginning of our Who Needs God series, and you're trying to figure out whether or not you need God in your life. I want you to see in this story that Jesus isn't asking you to take a leap of faith where there's no good reason to believe. I want you to see that he's asking you to take a step of faith because he is giving people a reason to believe. As we close our service today, I can't think of a better way to conclude our service than by taking communion together. For the last 2,000 years, followers of Jesus Christ have taken communion together as a way of celebrating the blood that Jesus spilled and the sacrifice that Jesus made so that we could be made right with God. We look at this moment in time and we do not just see that Jesus did something for people on a physical level. He did something for people on a much greater spiritual level. He didn't just come to help us with our marriage crisis or our midlife crisis, our professional crisis, or any other crisis. He came to address a bigger crisis. That because of our sin, we have a broken relationship with a heavenly Father. That's a crisis. And it's one that can only be solved through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. If there could have been another way, I'm pretty sure God would have chosen another way. But he chose that way because it's the only way that God can execute justice, that he can punish sin, but so that he can forgive his people. And so if you're not a follower of Jesus, here's what I would ask of you. You've got those elements in your hand right now. And what I want you to do, if you're not a follower of Jesus, is I just want you to keep it. I want you to keep that cup. I want you to keep that little piece of bread in the top. And I want you to think long and hard about the greater way that Jesus provided. That as you think about your life and what's it look like for me to be reconciled with God, and you're thinking, man, I'm going to clean myself up. I'm going to clean up my language. I'm going to quit that addiction or that behavior. I'm going to fix my marriage. Instead of you trying to do it all by yourself, I would encourage you to look at that cup and go, man, I can either try to do it myself and fail over and over again, or I can let Jesus do it for me. And when you finally become convinced, whether that's today or 10 years from now, when you finally become convinced that Jesus is greater, that he has a greater way for you to be made right with the Heavenly Father, then and only then, I want you to break open that cup and I want you to drink those elements. By that point, the juice may have turned to wine. That's okay, okay? I want you to take it at that point in your life. For the rest of you who are followers of Jesus, you have the elements in your hand. I want you to take off the top layer. I want you to take that piece of bread out. I want you to break it into your hands, and I want you to remember what Jesus said on the night that he was about to be betrayed. He said, "This is my body, which is broken for you. Eat this in remembrance of me." And then the disciples ate. Likewise, he took the cup. You can peel that part back at this point. The cup was full of wine. He passed it around. And he said, "This right here is my blood, which is getting ready to be poured out for you. I want you to drink it in remembrance of me." And they all drank as followers of Jesus, who were putting their faith and their hope in Jesus to do something greater for them that they could never do for themselves. Will you pray with me? Jesus, as we take communion today, we are so grateful for the sacrifice that you made for us. For all those who are in the room and all those who are watching online right now, if you've never put your faith in Jesus, I understand and recognize that you may need a little help with that. And so I just want to help you right where you sit. Let's just pray together. You can just say, "God, I've been trying to get right with you by cleaning up my own life. I realize today that is a task that I'm not very good at. Every time I clean it up, I seem to mess it up. So Jesus, I'm asking you to do something for me that I've never been able to do for myself. Wash me clean. Make me right with God, now and forevermore." And if that's a prayer that you pray, you need to know there's nothing powerful about those words, but there's something powerful about your faith. We would love to know about the decision that you're making. If you could take a moment, fill out that Connect card and say, "Today I put my faith in Jesus." We'll follow up with you. We want to talk to you about going public with your faith by being baptized in the month of March. Love to help you in that step of your faith journey. God, we thank you that you're a God who doesn't just care about us spiritually. We're thankful that you're a God who cares about what's happening in our whole lives. God, I pray for your people who are going through a crisis. I pray, God, that you would show up and that you would show off, that you would provide more than they could ever need and better than they could ever need. And I pray, God, that through it all, you would use a crisis to grow their faith. And I pray it all in Jesus' name. Amen.